If you are looking into starting your own cardiac CT practice, SCCT has developed a tool to help you efficiently achieve your goal. The SCCT Starter Kit is a broad set of resources compiled by clinicians working in partnership with industry professionals. The kit is a one-stop collection of information that includes financial and operational planning templates, resources for clinical procedures, guides for personnel training and credentialing, device and equipment information, marketing tools, and more. Resources are available by link or for download. Subscribers have access to a Q&A and discussion forum. Check it out at scctstarterkit.org. Welcome back, listeners, to another episode of The Donut of Destiny, the podcast on all things cardiac CT for anyone interested in cardiovascular imaging. My name is Praveen Ranganath, and I'm a radiologist in Dallas, Texas.
And my name is Alastair, and I'm a cardiologist in Leicester in the UK.
Today's episode is yet another installment in our Building a Cardiac CT program series. The flavor of this episode is coronary CT in the emergency department. To provide his experience and insight on this topic is none other than Dr. Brian Ghoshhajra. Brian is the current president of the Society of Cardiovascular CT and the division chief of cardiovascular imaging at Massachusetts General Hospital. Brian, welcome on board.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks very much for coming on. I feel a little different in the shoes of being the host with you on the podcast compared to being your fellow beforehand. Hopefully I don't mess up as much now as I did back then.
Well, I have to say in this regard, you're ahead of me, Praveen. I'm a longtime listener, first-time caller in this role here, so I'm glad to be a part of the podcast for once.
Fantastic, Brian. Thanks for joining. Now, let's get to it then, shall we? Brian, you're well known in the cardiac CT community, but could you just take a moment to talk about your highlights in your cardiac CT journey to date?
Thanks, Alastair. So, my journey into cardiac CT and really coming and doing a fellowship in this sort of started because of emergency coronary CT. I was a resident in 2005 back in Pittsburgh, and the hospital I worked at was one of the first in the city to get a 64-slice CT scanner, which at the time was considered, and I think still is considered, the minimum price of entry technically to perform clinical coronary CT angiography. And I happened to be studying for my physics board, so it was a very, formative time for me. And just all these new technologies and differences in the way that the slice counts went up and how we handled those images. And around that same time, it was in my second year of residency, I started to realize, keeping up on the literature is a very important part of any physician's duties. And so beyond just textbook, but kind of watching publications. And I saw this group at Mass General led by Tom Brady and Udo Hoffman and Sonny Ibarra, Ricardo Curry. They were just pumping out papers left and right. And what we found really interesting at our hospital was this idea of using coronary CT in emergency patients. I think in that era, you could probably publish a paper on 64-slice CT of anything, like 64-slice CT of the toes, and you would have a radiology paper. But what was really interesting is they were also publishing in more clinical journals and some early experiences doing this. Now, of course, these scans were done as part of blinded studies that were just convenient studies done during the evolution of clinical care. But it was really fascinating. And then they kind of did subsequent papers saying, hey, this actually does work. And it's a really good way to spot the patients with potentially significant atherosclerotic disease and who you can safely rule out and discharge home. And of course, they weren't the only people in this space. It really blew up quickly. But when I came out to Mass General for the interview and I got to meet the team, I said, this is where I need to be. So it sort of led me to an academic fellowship and ultimately to an academic career. And it really is one of the killer apps, if you will, for coronary CT angiography, to be certain. I also should note, during that time, the literature was just exploding with CT coronary angiography, really, for many roles. But the idea of doing this in the ED was so appealing that even at this small hospital, my training program only had 13 residents and 13 staff. We were able to initiate a program and duplicate efforts. So certainly didn't lead to any publications or any massive academic efforts like it did for Udo Hoffman, but it was really reading about it and just watching it quickly spread throughout the world, it kind of led me into this whole career.
So, Brian, was the outpatient coronary CT program already well established at MGH by the time you joined, or was the outpatient and ED programs kind of running concurrently?
Well, it's interesting. There's parallel threads here. Certainly, it was a very successful program long before I arrived. And I should also note, though, that research trials in emergency coronary CT were still going on when I was a fellow. I came to Mass General in the summer of 2008. And at that time, we were kind of between the ROMICAT trials. So ROMICAT 1 was a single site, and ROMICAT 2 was the multi-center randomized trial. Other trials went on too. The Akron PA trials led by Harold Litt were about to get underway. The William Beaumont studies, Gil Raff and company. But what was interesting was that we were initiating a trial just as I arrived during my research and clinical fellowship in double and triple rule-outs, and it was called the CAPTURE trial. Turned out to be a null study, but it taught me a lot about recruiting patients and the difficulty in practically executing a trial. It's not so simple. So it taught me what I suppose most people that get involved in research at all know pretty quickly, which was just that how much respect we all have for a trial and a big trial, because a randomized controlled trial is a little different animal than just convenience sampling what you might happen to scan. And so I got to participate in that and also enjoy some of the frustrations of, waiting around for the scanner, doing a separate research pathway of reading. And so when you do a trial that involves emergency patients and you're doing it on clinical care, that gets a little dicey and a little more high stakes. So I found that to be high pressure but high reward situation. And then shortly afterward, Udo and the gang were writing the ROMICAT 2 grant, and it got funded. And this was a multi-center randomized trial, multiple hospitals across the country, of which we were a site. So as I came on faculty, we were beginning that trial. Now, we, of course, all along had good outpatient and inpatient practice, outpatients being the primary use of CT. But as emergency cases came, we always directed them into one of the trials. And what happened for me as I was a new faculty, we've concluded the ROMICAT 2 trial. It was published in 2012, and it was in a small trade society journal in the region here. It's called the New England Journal of Medicine. So that was a pretty big win for, and actually that was one of two papers on emergency coronary CT published in the New England Journal that year. The first was Harold Litt's Akron PA trial showing the efficacy and safety of CT angiography in ED patients. And then Udo's really showed the efficacy and the, showing that the disposition times and the resource use that was potentially tied up was far lower. But you can read about that, and I'm certainly just an amateur participant in that study. But when you look at the task that I was faced with as kind of a new emerging clinical leader in our hospital was that the emergency department really wanted this. And I thought, well, it's a good example of the knowing doing gap, right? So we have all these great papers showing that you can use this technology, but the trialists move on to the next one. And the clinical care still needs to happen. And it seemed an awful waste to not turn this clinical service on, especially when we were the ones that kind of were one of several leaders around the world talking about the use of this technology. So one thing led to another, and now we didn't have the ability to direct someone into our research coordinator's pager when they wanted an emergency coronary CTA, and we really couldn't say no, but did become a little less convenient. During the trials, things went in sort of a banker's hours kind of configuration. So, it was Monday through Friday, non-holidays, non-weekends. If we had a recruiter around that could randomize you and do all the data collection, we also got bloods. They were, there's sub-studies still going on, I think, from ROMICAT 2. HS troponin was launched out of that trial and some other clinical tools. But in the clinical world, you don't really get to say no. And the other thing is emergency care never stops. So it's a 24/7 kind of story. But even in a larger program like Mass General, we did not have the staff nor the appetite to do this round the clock. So we needed to figure out what we could do safely and what we could do reasonably and mimic the results of the trial. And so that sort of led to an important life lesson for me as an emerging faculty.
So, listeners, just to give you a quick PICO summary of ROMICAT 2, it was a US-based multi-center randomized control trial which recruited 1,000 acute chest pain patients without flagrant EKG or troponin abnormalities, and it randomized one-to-one patients to either early coronary CTA or standard care, with the primary outcome being length of stay. And in those randomized to the coronary CT, the hospital stay reduced by 7.6 hours, and more patients were directly discharged from the emergency departments. So, Brian, I guess there are a couple of things that I have about that sort of setup. Is the CT scanner actually in the emergency department, and how long is it taking for you guys to report these, what are now probably round-the-clock coronary CTs being performed on patients coming in with acute chest pain?
So great question, Alastair. We still do not do this round the clock, but the time we do for reporting, we hold ourselves to about 1 hour after the scan. So it takes a little longer than a standard study, since there's a few more images, there's some PACS transfer issues. We do have a scanner in the emergency department, though we did not when we started. And I don't think you really need one. We started just on the scanner we normally use, so it's what you're comfortable with, and we would transport the patients upstairs. Although I often said, in a big hospital like ours, bringing a patient up 2 floors is about the same as sending them from Boston to Kansas, because there's transport issues and elevator rides. So when we finally did implement a equivalent scan, actually a better scanner in our ED to start our emergency scans, wow, what a boon, because you could just wheel the patient over. And in a large, I think there's more than 100 beds in our emergency department. So it's a really important place to keep your patients local, and that's the way all other CT was done. But that being said, we also started a task force before we started doing emergency coronary CT. We said, let's get all the stakeholders involved. And we got not just the cardiac imagers. So we're a radiology administrated joint program. So we've got cardiologists and radiologists that read. We've got trainees. We've got a separate emergency radiology department, which is the first of its kind in the world. Actually, it was founded here by Bob Noveline years ago. And there's other stakeholders that are probably more important than the imagers, and that would be the emergency department physicians. They have a whole set of advanced practice providers that help manage their chest pain unit, their observation unit, which sees a lot of chest pain. We've got a flock of interns and residents at every level of the way here, and fellows. And then we also have internal medicine. We've got cardiology, and as well as the subspecialty cardiology programs like the cath lab and the nuclear lab, all of which might touch one of these patients. So we got representatives from each into the same room, and we said, hey, we obviously know you've all read the papers, and you know this works, and there's a tremendous interest, but let's talk about what our goals are. And as you articulated, some people said, hey, 24/7, right? It's what we need. But the group very quickly coalesced around the fact that we had a really stellar reputation on the patients we did clinically already, and we had a really good result in our research. So they asked us, do what you need to do to make sure that you keep this quality the same. So please don't go doing 24/7 if you think that would lead to a suffering in quality or a decrement in the accuracy of the scan reads. So above all else, safety first and accuracy first. And so we took that charge and we discussed what we could offer. And so we decided to start small. So it was really 8 to 3, weekdays, no holidays, no weekends. And we started, and also the CT technologists had to have a big role in this. We couldn't just expect that we had the expertise around the clock. So we said, let's start slow and we'll offer it. And it didn't really take off the way we thought it would at first. So there was the people that were believers and the people that had participated in the trial with us. But after a couple of months, we asked to get audience with the emergency medicine faculty, because they have staff meetings just like any other group of physicians. So we went there, and Udo and our collaborator Toby Nagurney, who is one of our researchers on the ROMICAT, he ran the ED research department at Mass General in emergency medicine. So the three of us trudged down. I believe Quinn Trong, who was one of our faculty at the time, and our ROMICAT PI, she came along. So after our multidisciplinary task force meeting, we kind of took a road show to the ED, and we showed them what we could do. And we just told them about it, raise awareness. And then we got a little more interest. And so we explained to them that we had these only certain hours of availability. And as the service built, we saw that the patterns started to emerge. Not everybody in the ED felt like they needed to use a coronary CT, and we said, "Hey, dealer's choice. It's a free market of imaging, if you will, and you can certainly admit your patient, grab a stress ECG or a nuclear test or whatever you feel like doing. We won't tell you how to practice medicine. We're just here if you need us." And that went pretty well. So just kind of gradually ramping up. I also learned communication is very important. So the ED really wanted feedback. And if you think about the way that clinical care evolves on an inpatient or an ED patient basis, you're often doing shift work, as we do in imaging as well. So you might not be there to close the entire loop. Even if you did dramatically lower the dispo times from a median time of 27 hours down to something like 8 hours, that still might cross over a shift. So the scan you ordered might not be resulted, or the downstream catheterization might not be performed by the time you went home. So we started keeping a list of patients. And at first it was like a spreadsheet we'd email back and forth to each other with a research fellow of mine, Arshna Vadvala. And then it evolved and evolved. And man, so many fellows had that. We had to put it into a REDCap database eventually and keep it secure. But we tracked every patient. And so I could tell you what happened to every single patient. We watched patterns. We watched closely to make sure that the trial results were duplicated. If you wanted to know our positive predictive value for the patients that did go to CAF, I could tell you that. If you wanted to know our dispo times versus the ROMICAT trial, I could tell you that. We've published this, and it was actually better. So that was interesting. It was better when we did scans the same day. Obviously, if somebody came in overnight, we would hold them and scan them. But those results were pretty good too. So,
and Brian, I'm just guessing that, as you start to build this sort of program and it ramps up, the volume is the thing that tends to be, the breaking point for a lot of services. How do you now start screening patients for eligibility for CT? Is it still the free-for-all, or do you have to prioritize and have a layer of triage based on either biomarkers or pretest probability?
Oh, very much so. So when we started our program, we said, "Hey, we did do this, small randomized control trial. It's only 1,000 patients, but that's pretty good. Or sorry, 10,000 patients. But the idea would be maybe let's do it that way, since that kind of outlined the rules of the game." So we said negative initial biomarkers, or not definitively positive, not definitively positive ECGs. And if you want to break those rules, let's talk. And we decided as a multidisciplinary committee, which continued to meet, by the way. So we said, "Hey, if you want to break the rules, let's talk, and let's keep it staff to staff and cardiology consult." Because the last thing we want to do is do a scan that's just redundant or layered on top of the inevitable path or the MRI that was a more appropriate next test in the first place. So it wasn't that we didn't want to empower our emergency department. We just knew there's an accessibility to CT and an ease of triage that happens with CT beyond most other modalities. And people respected that pretty well. We only had a few rules, but ultimately we actually did write up all the times we decided to break the rules, and it kind of was a precursor to the rapid CTA trial, showing pretty much the same thing, that CT actually does pretty well. But also that's a careful selection bias of people that developed into a CT patient in the setting of a emerging cardiology consult. So there was still a layer of protection that went on there, and a good selection bias to lead to a CT. But that being said, we kind of codified a lot of the same things in the recent SCCT guidelines. The latest one was led by Chris Maroulis. It just kind of said what we all knew and what we all did in the trials, which is, low to intermediate risk for the most part. And that was done with troponin classic assay at first, and then eventually HS troponin, which is kind of rewriting the rules of the game, to be honest, and maybe obviating the need for some of the scans we would have done before. We don't have to do because the troponin is so sensitive, which is a good thing, because we don't want to do imaging that's not going to be helpful either.
Yeah, so Brian, you mentioned the transition into the era of the high sensitivity cardiac troponin, and that kind of happened after the completion of ROMICAT-2 and sort of the ramp up of the clinical ED program you had. Things that we often talk about on the podcast are like the impact of the Beacon trial on that initial thinking of shortening that length of stay in the emergency department. Does it still exist in the era of high sensitivity troponin? And in your previous response, you mentioned the rapid CTCA trial. Just for our listeners out there, as a reminder, the RAPID trial was performed in the UK across 37 different hospitals. The primary outcome was a composite of all-cause death, non-fatal MI, and it was done at 1 year's time. Basically, the headline result here was that there was no difference at 1 year in the primary outcome between the two arms, and the hazard ratio was around 0.9. There were, however, fewer invasive coronary angiograms in the CT arm compared to the standard of care arm. So that helps support the role of cardiac CT in being a gatekeeper to the cath lab. With all of this in mind, Brian, how do current practitioners who are trying to get an ED program off the ground justify the initial resources they need to put in the context of this fantastic test, high sensitivity cardiac troponins?
Oh, certainly. Great question, Praveen. Certainly, if a relatively rapid and cheap lab test can prevent the need for imaging, we're all for it. It turns out, though, that the gray zone troponins are the ones that kind of really need to evolve, as well as all of the papers that have looked at HS troponin have also shown that you can still have unstable angina pectoris as one of the three types of acute coronary syndrome. And that can happen without any troponin leak at all. So clinical suspicion can still overrule the lab work and lead to a workup. And we see this all the time, even triple vessel disease, and it can just present with vague symptoms. So clinical judgment certainly has a massive role. In fact, all these scores like the heart score and all those others, there's still an element of the score which comes from clinical suspicion. So we can't hang up our practicing physician hats just yet. So you have those elements at play. And then you also have these kind of, they're not high, they're not low lab values, which definitely warrant some kind of workup. So I think CT has a sweet spot there. It is important to remember that all these trials were done before the era of HS troponin. So the use of CT has evolved. Our understanding of the types of acute coronary syndrome and the coronary pathology that can happen. I'm talking about USCAD, right? So I didn't even know that existed when I came to fellowship, and it became a sort of a diagnosis du jour, and it really helped to raise awareness. And we see it more frequently than we care to admit. And so it certainly needs to be reconciled with this intermediate or even high troponins where we use CT.
Listeners, this concludes part 1 of this 2-part conversation with Brian on building an ED cardiac CT program. Be sure to tune in next time for part 2. As always, thank you very much for tuning into the podcast. We really appreciate your support. Please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe to us on whatever podcast platform you use. This helps others out there find us too. Once again, this is the Donut of Destiny. Cheers. Remember to check out the SCCT Starter Kit for a collection of useful resources to help guide healthcare facilities interested in starting a cardiovascular CT program for their patients. It is available for SCCT members free of cost, and it is available for non-SCCT members for a subscription fee of $300 per year.